Let's get this started. All right. And I am that person, because there's nothing as much fun as gratuitous technology. So make sure this is working. Looks like I'm good. So hi, I'm Kat White, and we're going to have the opportunity tonight to talk about structured data and the SEO magic therein. I even have like a cool transition for because it's magical. Isn't that nice? Like that. Don't worry, we're not going to watch that the whole presentation, but we can do it like one more time because I think it's kind of fun. There we go. I know. Ooh, ah. So thank you, Brandon, for the introduction. As I said, my name is Katherine White. I am actually a longtime Austinite, as you can tell, because Cedar season has started. And once you hit about the 6-year point in Austin, you're incapable of talking or breathing for a couple of months. I am a solutions architect and engineer. I began my journey with Drupal over 10 years ago now. I started working in Drupal 5 and have stayed with it since then. I am the director of engineering at Kanopi Studios. As a architect type, I'm a bit of a data nerd. And so this topic is near and dear to my heart because I'm one of these people who loves to put things in things. Categorization makes me very happy. I can't go near a container store. We're going to talk a little bit about structured data, which is kind of a categorization methodology for your content on the web. We're going to talk about what it is. We're going to talk about why we should be using it. The formats that are available for working with structured data, and then what that actually looks like in the context of Drupal. So what is structured data? Who here has actually worked with structured data in some form or fashion before? Awesome, a number of people. Okay, great. You may find this very boring. If you find errors in my talk, let me know afterwards. Structured data is meta information about your content. So it can define a single tiny element of content on your page. So say a contact person, or it can describe the page in its entirety. What we are looking at is an article on some high level. So, and obviously it's the kind of thing that you can nest one within another. So structured data has the potential to get pretty complex. These are semantic constructs. So they are machine-oriented language that's very core to the semantic web. So the idea behind this is to create a structure around content on your page. We talk a lot about semantic HTML, right? It's kind of an enhancement of that, or another type of semantic construct that lets us provide granular definition around individual elements that make it. And because it's so repeatable, it makes it easier at the broader web level, semantic web level for machines and search engines to make sense of your content and understand its larger place in the content hierarchy that exists on the web. So why do we use it? That's all very heady, but not terribly practical. Well, we use it because search engines love it. So if you have no other reason, this is a good reason to start. Structured data, and specifically schema.org, was founded by your search engine companies. So the initiative behind the idea of having this sort of structured content came from Google, Microsoft, Yahoo, and the others. So they were kind of behind the initial creation of schema.org and the schema definer it. As we mentioned, it's structured and it's repeatable. Well, that means that it's easy for search engines to take that information, categorize it, understand what to do with it, and weight it appropriately based on the type of content you're providing. It gives them a lot richer context with which to evaluate the contexts in which your content is valuable. The truth about it is, so if you've ever been to schema.org, yeah, it's beautiful, right? Really easy to understand. It's totally intuitive. It's very easy to get lost in schema very quickly because they are. As I said, it can get extremely granular and extremely complex about little teeny tiny entities that are connected to this whole, right? The good news is that from an SEO perspective, there are really certain types of content where it matters for practical purposes, even though there are zillions of schema out there, they're not on this list. Generally speaking, if you are working in local markets, if you are publishing articles or recipes, or event listings, and obviously product data. There are places those are places that this is going to be highly valuable for you and worth doing on your sites. Depending on the type of content, or may not be as critical. That said, it's never a bad. So how do search engines use this information? What do they do with it? Well, for the most part, what you'll see is featured placement. So I'm going to go through a few examples of types of featured placement. All of my examples are pulled from Google because that's the search engine I work with the most frequently. And to that end, the thing I want to point out about these featured results is we've probably all seen them, right? You've seen like gorgeous, like, I love to cook, so you've seen like gorgeous recipe blocks, right? With star ratings and thumbnail images and time to prep and all this rich information that appears that makes a search listing stand out. Most recent data I could find on this dates from 2014, but it's still interesting because Search Metrics did a study on this and analyzed Google search results and found that about 36% of the results that Google presents use schema markup. However, on the whole, that only accounts for 0.3% of the websites that are actually using this technology. So it has the potential to provide an enormous boost in terms of your findability. Now, naturally, this is SEO tends to be something of a dark art, and there are no guarantees. But what you'll find statistically, search engines really like this. So what types of feature placement are we talking about? Well, enhanced search result listings, like we were just discussing. Placement in featured carousels. So depending on the type of content, you may see content that you can scroll through on your mobile device with your thumb, or carousels of content from a single site, for example, depending on the context of your search query. Knowledge panels, which give you information like company contact information, and rich data about organizations. And then there are these immersive search experiences, some of which I only stumbled on when I started really digging into this and kind of discovering what was out there, that really help kind of qualify your leads. So this is an example when we're talking about enhanced search results, right? The thumbnails, ratings, the detailed information. So the big question here is, what do you have to do to get there? How do you get your recipes to show up in this listing? And the answer is schema. It's structured markup. These examples are all done using JSON-LD. So we're going to go through 3 different formats for implementing structured data. This is the most recent, and so it's the one I'm going to show. But as you can see, if you're familiar with this, it's a standard JSON object that provides meta-level information about your recipe. This is the stuff the search engines are consuming. It gives them a greater degree of context for the content that you're serving. Knowledge graphs or knowledge panels. Again, the ability to directly access phone numbers, contact information, all of their social media profiles. This kind of content also is coming from structured data. In this case, we're looking at data of type organizations, the data type recipe. There are a lot of properties under these things. You're not going to see them all represented here. A lot of the times, some properties are optional, some are not. Some search engines don't necessarily agree with schema about what is optional and what is not. But you'll see, again, kind of this high-level outline of the greater context of your content. Mobile carousels. So in a mobile context, especially with Google, this kind of structure is highly valuable. These are, again, carousels of grouped results by site in this case. And these are also pulling from that kind of recipe. You also have these immersive experiences. And the things that I think is interesting about these is that they really lead to qualified clicks and content. So for example, if you're looking for jobs, Google actually has now an in-Google application that allows you to browse job listings, hear in context, turn on email alerts for a particular search. People can do a lot of upfront research and have a lot of upfront interaction with your content before they ever reach your site. So when they actually get to you, they're already really highly qualified in terms of the level of engagement with your brand and your content. How do they do it? Same kind of idea. This is a type of job posting. The another one of the content listings where this kind of data is extremely valuable. Another one, because I'm a bit of a music nerd that I like to share, is discographies. So if you work in music and film are actually one of the places where you will see this used the most currently. But the idea here is that, again, people can drill really deep into your album content, into your context, into your brand, before they ever actually get where they're going. So they've done a lot of their purchase consideration without ever having to interact with your site directly. It's just that context that it's important to provide that content yourself and make sure that you educate people and provide consideration content for your brand. But this is just another way that people are out there interacting with your content and with your brand outside the context of your own business. It's critical to remember that a lot. And this is just an example of the album. The thing to know about this is that you do get out of it what you put in. Implementing schema data on your site is not necessarily straightforward, depending on the type of content that it is. There are some things that are pretty easy to do out of the box, and some things that are hard. Any amount of it is helpful, but like I said, this can be a serious rabbit hole, depending on, on what you want to do. So it takes a lot of effort, but it is worthwhile. And I think that this is honestly the reason, to a large extent, why we've seen relatively low rates of adoption. So what are the formats that we use to implement structured data? So when we talk about structured data, we're talking about schema, and the seminal source of schema is schema.org. For a while, there were other schema formats running around, but this is really what everything is standard. It's not at this point. Before we go too deep into this, I do want to make sure that we talk about vocabulary, which is kind of a poor choice of words because vocabulary is part of schema. But anyway, when we're dealing with schema.org specifically, we're talking about vocabularies. Vocabularies are a collection of schema. So schema.org is a vocabulary. Okay? Schemas will define a thing. That thing can be a creative work. Okay? And then generally, things of types. So if you start with a thing that is a creative work, it'll have a type of recipe, let's say, or art, or what have you. And then those types have individual properties. And that's stuff that we get into in, okay, what's your cook time? How many reviews do you have? You know, what is your ingredient list, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So schema.org itself provides a really wide variety of these object definitions. And these schemas are hierarchical. If you are familiar with object-oriented programming concepts, there's an inheritance factor here with schema. So you're going to start with very, very high-level properties, and you're going to get more and more specific. The more specific you get, you can interleave and nest these objects. So you can have contact within the context of something else. And you can implement them using any of these data formats that we're going to talk about. So there are three main ones to think about. All of these will have examples on schema, depending on what it is that you want to work with. Microdata is the first, kind of the granddaddy. It's the format initially used on schema.org. It is an HTML specification, so it's attribute-based. And it's going to feel fairly familiar if you're just getting started with this concept. So the idea of microdata, this is an article schema example. As you can see, it's property value pairs the same way you would do with pretty much any other HTML file. You're just specifying your item type schema and then going with it. So it's all in line with the markup, a part of the markup that you're doing yourself. RDFa is similar. I always like to know what these things stand for. So RDFa is Resource Description Framework in Pattern. It's a little bit more XML flavored, but it looks very similar to Microdata in practice. It is an extension of HTML5. And this is a bit of a statement of preference, but I actually find that it's a little bit easier than Microdata for representing nested. I find it a little bit easier, relatively speaking. So here's an RDFa example. You're going to see it's very, very similar. But here we're specifying both the vocabulary and the type independently And then running down through properties and scoping things from there. So, and you can see in this example, it's a little bit easier to manage the nested components that have different types. So, both of these solutions are markup-based. They sit in line with your HTML. So there are some considerations to think about with that. You add these attributes to your existing markup to define the thing. That's really cool because it minimizes your data redundancy, right? You're not adding a whole bunch of extraneous markup to your page to support this level. And it keeps the definition of the schema, the thing that you're defining, with the thing itself. So in terms of keeping track of what definitions go with what, it's all encapsulated. On the downside, it's not as easy to read as it might be. And it's a little bit squirrely to implement, to inject all these attributes. It certainly is not like an insurmountable hurdle, but it's not a part of it. So there are drawbacks to these approaches. JSON-LD, on the other hand, is the newer player on this scene. JSON-LD stands for JavaScript Object Notation for Linked Data. This is just a JSON object, and it contains the same kind of property listing that we've looked at previously. It can be injected into the document. We can stick it in the body or in the head, it doesn't matter. It's much easier for humans to read than your more inline formats. JSON-LD is strongly preferred by Google. I say that as a caveat because Bing actually doesn't really support it. It's not formally. But especially when you're working with accelerated mobile pages, the combination of JSON-LD and accelerated mobile pages is something that so Google has some great resources, and I've got links later in this presentation. Their kind of guide to structured data is a great starting point, and they will pound JSON-LD pretty heavily. It does though result in some data redundancy. So you're taking everything that is and you're defining it in another object and sticking it in your site. And it's decoupled from the actual context of the content. Whether or not that's a big deal is kind of up to you. Personally, I think that the benefits outweigh the problems with this thing. So here's a JSON-LD example. We've looked at a number of these. So, but again, this is that same article kind of schema implemented in this context. So obviously there's a lot of markup, there's a lot of properties, there's a lot of stuff going on. So how the heck do we know if we even did it? The good news is Google provides great tools for this. And the one caveat I want to make here is that Google does not implement it. So, and I alluded to this earlier, Google has properties that they view as required. They're not necessarily formally required by the schema on schema.org. Okay? And then, schema will have properties that it claims are required that Google doesn't actually care about. So just know that when you're looking at this tool, there is going to be some discrepancies between the two. But this is the Google Structured Data Testing tool. And there's a link in here that'll take you to it. And what you're actually looking at here is I spun up a local D8 installation and ran the core RDFa stuff with Google just to see what I would get. So that's actually a point of trivia. But what this will do is it will actually go through and give you a much more readable version of everything Google's interpreting out of structured markup. So this is great for debugging your work, for getting used to using the tools, and kind of understanding how to use this technology. There are a lot of options. Right? There's mud. What format are we actually supposed to use? They're all valid. They're all good for different types of things and different types of developers. My personal thing would be, if you're in doubt, go with JSON-LD unless Bing is your thing. So I have actually talked to a number of developers who implement 2 of these formats. They'll do JSON-LD because Google loves it, and then they'll be doing RDFa or Microdata in line with their content to support search engines that are not as JSON happy. That's double the work, but it gets you the coverage across all the search engines. So at this point, this is the recommended standard. So my assumption is that it will gain traction. So if you can start with just one, this is probably where I would go if you're just getting started. So what about Drupal? How do we do this in Drupal? This is really neat. I'm going to produce articles on Drupal. It's going to be awesome, and I want everybody to be able to find them. So how the heck do I do this in a Drupal context? Public service announcement. None of this matters if you're not at least doing basic metadata on your sites. So know and love metadata module. Do that first. Because really, high-level metadata about your pages and about your site is going to be the most important thing you can do for findability. There are a couple of options. One which I spoke about briefly earlier is the core RDF module. So this is one I was super excited was in core for D8. So I turned it on and played with it. And as you probably saw in my screenshot, what I found is it doesn't validate with Google out of the box. And you can't really define a lot of discrete types. It's great for articles. And really what it means is, I mean, it's certainly something you can extend, but there's not much you can actually manipulate without getting involved. That may or may not be a deal breaker for you. And it's great. It produces RDFa, so it gives you that kind of inline context out of the gate, which is fantastic. There's also the schema.org meta tag module, and this is one I wanted to bring up. So we mentioned using the meta tag module. This is a schema.org specific extension of meta tag. So, Karen Stevenson at Lullaby is one of the primary brains behind this. It's relatively new, and I'm super excited to see where it goes. But this is built on top of meta tag, and out of the box, it provides support for a limited number of schema.org types. And it provides a framework to add whatever types it is that you need. So, I mean, there are a lot of issues in the issue queue about, please add videos, please add this, please add that. Good news is, how much of that, because there's such proliferation of schema out there, how much of that's really going to be built into the core of the module, I think is questionable. But the good news is the architecture is there to go and add whatever it is that you need to add. That's something we do. So I'm excited to see where that one goes. So that's really it. We talked about what Structured is, why it's worth using, the formats that you can use to implement this on your site, and kind of what some of your basic options are for D8. And that's all I've got. We have some resources here. Most of the things that I alluded to in the presentation, the Google Intro to Structured Data is great. There's JSON-LD Playground, which is specific for getting used to kind of the JSON-LD format. You can go in there and do some real-time editing. See what you get. The Google Structured Data Testing tool, and then schema.org's full hierarchy, which is eye-crossing, but worth checking out. And that's it. So if you've got questions, feedback, I'll take it. Yeah.
2 or 3 questions. I was looking at schema.org and looking at some of the classes, and I saw a primary focus on food and maybe clothing. It seemed like a very narrow space. I didn't see, in my world, semiconductors or pick any other class. Is that
Interesting.
Yeah, so did I drill down somehow? Or?
I think you drilled down somehow. Because from a product perspective, there are a lot of different types of things that fall under product.
Okay.
So there are a number of schema that inherit product data.
Okay.
There's also a ton of schema dedicated to creative works, whether those are works of art, books, movies, albums. So there are definitely some high level categories, but it's very much all kind of a tree.
And then the next question: are there any cross-browser issues with any of the technologies? I mean, you're regulating JSON-LD. I mean, minor things, major things. I guess not major things.
Not that I've seen, because all of this is fairly native technology. So it's either just a JavaScript object, or it's properties in your markup, which I won't speak for like. Supporting 96, I'm not going to speak for what that's doing, but on the whole, these are kind of native functions of HTML and JavaScript. So typically, when a browser renders HTML, if it sees a property, it doesn't recognize it, just sees it. So you're not going to run into rendering problems based on this. The trick to that, though, is if you start trying to like hide it in random little elements, right? And you start trying to like tag invisible spans with things or like crazy stuff like that, which I don't recommend. You might run into some issues, but in general, you got logical markup will work.
And you'll post this on the meetup or rework or whatever it's called nowadays. Site.
Yeah. If you want to hit my, I can get them posted on. I'm not sure how that works, Stephanie. You can definitely get them posted on the meetup. I've also got the link out on my Twitter. So you can grab it there.
The comments on the meetup to link there.
Okay.
And or we can, if we do use a video, we can post a video and use that.
Okay, great. Any other questions? Yeah.
So I don't have any introduction. How much of it is done by human?
For what kind of context?
So basically, we look at, showed us examples, recipe. There's a calorie count, cooking hour, things like that. It's probably like one item in the whole HTML page, so you can probably go in there and manually. But what about the rest of it?
It's kind of going to depend, I think, on how you've architected the solution. So if you're extending meta tag, you'll be able to structure your types so that most of this is injected for you. If you only have one little element on the whole thing, like your contact block and your footer that you want to mark up, it's probably overkill, and you can just build it into your templates. I think it really depends on what you're looking to do and how you've architected your site.
It's still very much just customizing by.
Be customizing by chunk. Yeah.
How familiar with what Drupal are you?
Completely.
So maybe if you go back to the schema.org screenshot, or the schema.org meta tag.
Yeah.
One. So one of the advantages of using Drupal for this kind of thing is generally if you were creating like a recipe thing in Drupal, we create what we call a content type. And in the content type, it would have all these different fields for like what's the recipe title, how long, what's the cook time for the recipe, what are the ingredients, add more, and a body and stuff like that. And so the advantage of this module specifically and the way that Drupal does structured data is in like the headline, you see like bracket, node, colon, title, bracket. That's a token. So every time you view a content of type recipe, it's going to put the title of the recipe in the JSON-LD or whatever thing you pick. So you only have to set up the structured schema.org stuff once for every kind of content type you have. Then every new piece of content you create, it automatically spits out the correct schema for that thing. So it's the combination of that Drupal already has allows you to build structured content types out of the box, and you can use tokens to plug things in where they're needed for your schema. That's the power of using Drupal, and why Drupal can make it easier for schema.org type stuff versus other systems.
Yeah, and why you can use Drupal.org to actually enable an end user who's writing a recipe to actually be able to follow the instructions to actually get the end result. So,
Because we're coming from where web development is now doing a lot of JavaScript. Just recently learned about Drupal being CMS, so just started examining.
So if you're working in JavaScript, are you familiar with working in, say, handlebars or any of those kinds of templating languages? Technologies, yeah. Okay, because it's another example. I mean, basically, there's like a JSON data structure, and JavaScript gets crunched and compiled into this template. And it's the same kind of idea where there's a variable or a token that sits there in your markup and gets replaced with the value of whatever records it is that you're using. So it's just kind of a similar.
One like 9 days away from today, so you'll
Yeah, I mean, one of the major differences between Drupal and a lot of other content management systems is that everything is a structured data type. Even a blog post is a structured data type. And so because you start with that, you want to build a recipe, right? Because you need special things for it. So you create a special content type. That way you can have one area that's just for ingredients. And then you can even you can use taxonomies and create all the ingredients that you could possibly use. So the data. Instead of just having someone type out a recipe and then trying to figure out where once you make it,
that's a much bigger conversation. But yeah.
Yeah, once you create the stuff to make it easier to find, it is.
It allows you to structure your data types so that the entry can be as guided or as freeform as you want. So it can be as complex or as simple as one WYSIWYG, or it can be dozens of fields.
Did you run across any other of the enhanced examples that you showed, like the Google job listing and the discography? Did you run across any others that were especially interesting? Or do you know of anything?
I'm trying to think. There are some interesting treatments for news articles. Since most of the news articles these days tend to be rather politicized, I choose not to put those in the presentation. But there are treatments for that that are kind of interesting. Again, it follows more of the carousel, specific like categorical grouping stuff. So that's out there. I want to say there's some special treatments for events, but I don't have them in front of me, so I'm not going to start with that.
I saw something in I think the Washington Post uses some type of customized CMS that maybe that they developed. And I'm sorry, this is my first view, so
no, it's great.
I'm not sure if I'm too far off topic. That's something that I saw that they did in their sports section in particular is for, I don't know, some percentage of very recognizable sports stars. There's a little box around their name where when you mouse over it, it gives you metadata about that person, like their scoring average, all this, yeah, like these stats. And I'm wondering if that's something that come from enhancement to like LD,
well, so I don't actually, so that's an interesting question. I don't know whether that's a formal schema or if that's just somebody's statistical data that's specific to their industry. I'd have to dig into schema to know, go looking for it. So I don't actually have an answer as to whether that is within this context.
I'll have to look and see. It's just
yeah. I will also say a lot of the news sites, don't really like the big news sites, their posts, because they don't have to do this.
Yeah.
So sometimes they're not the best examples to look at. Because of the amount of inbound link traffic they receive and just their overall online reputation, they are always going to perform well. Just because of the link.
I was thinking of it from an on-page presentation.
Yeah. From an on-page,
from an
yeah.
SEO.
From an on-page presentation perspective, there's a lot of different ways you can generate that kind of pop-up with statistical data. It may or may not be directly related to schema, but in terms of maintaining that data within a content management system, absolutely. That's the kind of thing where if we want to go back to like the structure, like everything is an entity, right? For example, we could have a player entity. That player could have statistics associated with it. That player could have teams associated with it. The teams are another entity. So just depending on how you need to build all of that out, be very specific to kind of your sports application. But there's a number of different ways that you could handle it.
I like to see that flipped over to the political side, actually. I like a mouse over.
Yeah.
And get those stats.
You find,
Texas Tribune. That sort of stuff.
Do they?
I think so. They're kind of more. I mean, it's much easier when you're dealing. While state politics are still very politicized, you're much more interested in who what your person is doing. It's so much more connected. And Texas Tribune is very politically active. Yeah. And not politically active in necessarily a side, but they're just trying to get Texans connected with what's going on in Austin in the legislature. So they tend to have a lot more of that sort of thing.
and they're on Drupal, last I heard.
That one's right in the year.
Yeah.
And yeah, I mean, and your bunch, and she said that that the big places don't, they don't have to do what's right. But that's how little people will come up. And, take a site like Huffington Post. It wasn't a major newspaper.
Oh yeah, this is definitely the type of stuff that is worth the effort. You're willing to put the effort in. It definitely increases your visibility because it increases the search engine's understanding of my larger point is just that just because they're big doesn't mean they're right.
Yeah.
And that's the case across pretty much every.
Well, and that's the truth. Yeah, that's true. I guess a lot of things you're better off looking at some, which I think has a pretty good web stack. They've done a really good job of being focused, and so they're much more likely to try and find these sorts of things to try and. Whereas the New York Times probably has to have a committee meeting, 10 people to decide what they do.
I'm not saying what they do isn't involved. It's just that they don't necessarily have to scrape for every advantage.
Yeah.
So do you find that if it's an advantage for smaller websites, our clients, do they know about this? Are they asking you for this? Or is this something that you're like, hey, by the way, this would be cool? I will say it's not something we do by default, clients, because it is kind of time intensive. When I have clients come in for whom SEO is a big focus, absolutely we have this discussion. So it kind of depends on what our clients' priorities are. And sometimes I will do it as a, hey, by the way, have you thought about this? An interesting topic guide this is an ad about this, where it's like, well, I don't know if I want my products to show up in these kind of contexts because everything looks bad. If I'm selling semiconductors, everything looks terrible if you don't understand the larger story about where we got value. To which my response is, well, then focus on doing structured markup around the things that tell your story that really drive where you bring that value. So there are a lot of contexts in which I'll have those conversations, but it's not something we do out of the box. And if you, how well does deciding to do this, you've already built a site and the client decides later, oh, well, now we have budget, let's go ahead and have this. Is that generally oh, we have to redo all of our content types, or does it kind of usually, if you already are making good architecture for websites, this just kind of fits in?
If you're already semantically structuring your HTML and you're making responsible architectural choices, it's not that hard to add. It is definitely, from my perspective, easier to populate and add a JSON object than it is for me to retrofit the HTML. So in terms of bang for the buck, that's where I would start probably under those circumstances because it's just easier to build and site.
Real quick, I just want to make sure I understood properly. But the nesting and the hierarchy of the types and stuff, is that, does search engine prioritize the stuff that's higher on top on the hierarchy, or is it just the way it's organized?
No, it's the kind of thing where, I'll give you an example. You have an organization, all right? Your organization is kind of this high level thing. Your organization is a organization and company, but then companies can have contacts, and contacts are type people. But a contact can also exist outside the context of the company, or it can cross-reference a company from within the context of the Contact object. So they're not.
Just like levels of specificity.
There's not really level, yeah. So again, it's like this cascading effect, right? You're getting more and more specific, but then you can have these other entities like people in your organization who are related to your organization, but they're not actually,
A part of.
they're not actually like lower down in the hierarchy than your organization. That makes sense?
Yeah.
So it kind of depends. Basically, typically you're only going to define, like when you talk about organizations and companies, you're just going to define that lowest level, and it's automatically going to inherit all properties and stuff above it. So you can use those properties in this context, but you don't actually have to give the full truth. It's a lot like classification.
Else?
I have some more comments, as a recipe aficionado. It feels like I noticed that this on Google not a long time ago. So yeah, so it feels like this was rolled out pretty recently. And I was always kind of wondering what combination of things got certain things such high attention. So it's kind of just nice to be like, oh, it makes a lot more sense now.
Yeah. I mean, it's obviously a complex thing. This is one facet of it. Your amount, I mean, obviously your rank, the number of inbound links, all of that is a factor in the content that they choose to highlight. This is just the information that helps them understand what to highlight, and gives your content a higher degree of specificity.
Have you done this for clients where you just kind of Google away, like all of a sudden they start popping up and the information is there? Or
No, because again, it's usually a bit of a selling point, and it's so under the hood that it's kind of hard for them sometimes to grasp how it works, why it works the way it works. I think where I have the most conversations with clients about metadata, it's much more at the page metadata open graph level, because that's the stuff that they really see, because that affects their social sharing. Given the kind of customized search algorithms on Google, the fact that most people are logged in a way that means they're getting custom search results, it can be really, really hard for people to see and understand where their page rank becomes kind of ephemeral.
That, and while this stuff is actually a decade old, Google's really only started getting into it like the last 2 years. Mostly because I think as Google's search results have declined, they look for other things. Quality of the results decline, they look for other things. And this is there actually are search engines out there that only work on schema information. So you can actually go and search, find completely. In other words, where Google has done, I think they started with recipes. They added jobs. But there's all sorts of stuff out there that you can search by using just this stuff around.
I want to say microdata was first introduced as a format.
Yeah, because it all starts with
I mean, I'm not
the article on the semantic web, and it's just kind of it's one of those things that's just kind of sat out there, and the Europeans are much more into it than we are, which has been part of it. So if you go to some of the European, they have like these European libraries that you can go there that searches all this stuff. It's built on all this sort of stuff, ECS stuff, and it's interesting stuff. But when the internet is ultimately run by large systems like Google and Facebook, having all this structured data isn't necessary. So it's interesting stuff to look at, but it's never been leveraged. It's just now really starting to be leveraged, and it's going to be interesting to see what. Because I mean, theoretically, Berners-Lee talks about using it to schedule a doctor's appointment, something like this, and you use these schemas so that the systems can talk to each other and know what they're saying, right? So this person and this person in this office and this, right? And that's what originally his idea was. And so he started looking at the schemas. And so this kind of this thing has been growing up there. And Google's just now kind of taken, started playing with it, getting more. There's some interesting stuff that's been done, research projects and just stuff in Europe. Europeans are really into this whole distributed sort of way, and schemas work really well for that. You distributed stuff and gather it. Whereas if you want to search the whole web, it still takes a whole copy of the web, and you have to have a large system for that. So that's what we do in here. And it's been around, and there's some really neat stuff that's been posed with it, but no one's, except Google is now like on Google, you can actually search for recipes, right? So you can, by using the schema information, you can say, like, if you're gluten free, it knows, the schemas can know what stuff has gluten in it. So it can take all the recipes that have things with gluten in it out of the search. So it's really useful stuff, but yeah, I mean, for a lot of, I can't imagine all the many clients that would have useful stuff at the current moment. Google does, right? Unless your jobs or recipes.
Courses is another one. Course listings is one that Google has. I think it's a similar experience to the stuff.
But theoretically, in the long term, I mean, and I was just back here thinking, I was actually wondering if you could actually write code to take schemas and make content.
That'd be fun.
Instead of trying to build it that way, build it the other way, and then it's already all set up to do it. And if this stuff actually takes off after 20
I think Microdata, I misspoke. I was just looking this up. I was looking at the first least reference and finding Microdata. I'm probably.
But yeah, it's one of those things. This is, I have a degree in library information science. This is one of those things that's been floating around in there, and there's the Europeans done some really interesting stuff with it, but they've not. Getting Americans on board to do such things is not very easy. Huh?
Market adoption's a problem. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, you literally have to get everyone to build all their stuff using content types that are already adopted and that have already filled all the stuff, which works for like library data, where we've been doing that for the past 50 years. But when it's just when 20 years ago we were literally writing HTML still pages for web pages, and so you have to doesn't translate.
So you could see some real interesting results if you use customized search operators to sort of, if you have a large website, you're just looking at the results for your own site. You had tons of different products, and you would see some of these elements, these customized page elements for just your results. It would work that way.
I have experimented with that.
Because in the past, like for customers, I've said, look, here's a search string. Just use this when you search, and it will get you closer to the results that you want.
Right.
Kind of pre-filter down so that I don't need
I think very well
to tell
made.
you how to do this.
Very well made.
And
with your,
And with Google, that doesn't really work.
Oh, really?
They've just but I mean, I know as sort of friends talk to you, the ability to focus in on search results on Google works for the last decade. I mean, a decade ago, you could change just little bits of words and find amazing sites. And because they're using a lot of synonyms, particularly, it doesn't work anymore. So basically, in a certain way, it makes it easier for people who have no idea what they're doing But those people who actually have some clue what they're looking for, it doesn't do those things. So, but theoretically, in a search engine built on schema, you can actually, you can actually do those sorts of things. You can ask, find me all of the recipes with that, all the recipes without gluten, or all the recipes with bananas. Or I think there's some person on the internet that about cooking and saying, oh, you know, what you do is put the recipe and put a list of 3 ingredients you have. Make whatever that is.
What can I make with one?
I have pork and pepper and bananas. What? Well, IBM took Watson and did weird stuff with food. So that and apparently bacon and chocolate together.
It is.
So, I don't judge.
Yeah, but it is an interesting thing because so many people are reinventing the wheel when they write applications that do that. It's an interesting idea of using structure available in schema.
Yeah, and that's if it ultimately goes. Part of it is the kind of question right now is it going to finally shift that way?
Mm-hmm.
And if it does, then working in the opposite direction gives you a major advantage because that means all your content types already have.
Yeah.
All of that. Thank you.
Yeah, absolutely.
Stop broadcast now. There's still plenty of pizza and stuff left over. Feel free to take cookies or anything home with you. And then